There is a building in Athens that the entire world recognizes and nobody actually sees. You've seen photographs, you've seen postcards, you've seen it on travel posters and history textbook covers and the logos of a dozen institutions that use its silhouette to signal civilization itself. The Parthenon, broken columns against a blue sky, the ruin that defines the word ruin, the most famous skeleton in architecture, so familiar in its destruction that you've never once asked yourself what it looked like before it was destroyed, so thoroughly identified with its broken state that the word Parthenon and the image of a ruin have become the same thought, inseparable, permanent, and that permanence is a lie. Because the Parthenon wasn't always a ruin. For over 2,000 years, it stood intact. Not the shattered colonnade you know from photographs, a complete building, roof intact, walls intact, interior chambers intact, sculptures in place, painted, gilded, functioning as a continuous architectural presence from the 5th century BC through the 17th century AD. Over 21 centuries of continuous existence as a complete structure. Surviving the fall of Athens, surviving the Roman conquest, surviving the transition to Christianity when it was converted into a church, surviving the Ottoman conquest when it was converted into a mosque, surviving earthquakes and wars and the complete turnover of every civilization that had built, used, and maintained it. And then, on the evening of September 26, 1687, a Venetian mortar shell arced through the Athenian sky and landed inside the Parthenon, which the Ottoman garrison was using as an ammunition magazine. The explosion blew the center out of the building. The roof was destroyed, the walls collapsed, 28 columns were brought down. The sculptures that had survived 21 centuries were blasted from their positions and shattered across the Acropolis. In a single evening, one of the most perfectly preserved buildings from the ancient world was converted into the ruin you know from every photograph ever taken of it. I need you to hold the timeline, because the timeline is the entire story. 2,100 years of survival, one evening of destruction, and every image you've ever seen of the Parthenon, every photograph, every painting in the modern era, every sketch from the 18th and 19th centuries, shows the building after the explosion. The Parthenon you know is the corpse. You've never seen the living building. Not because depictions don't exist from before 1687, but because the depictions that survive are so few, so limited, so difficult to access, that the modern world's mental image of the Parthenon has been permanently set to the post-explosion state. This raises a simple but critical question. What did the Parthenon actually look like before a Venetian general decided to fire a mortar into an ammunition dump inside the most important building in Western architectural history? The deeper I went, the more I found that the answer to this question has been systematically obscured, not by conspiracy, by something more effective, by the sheer dominance of the ruined image, by the cultural weight of 2 centuries of romantic fascination with ruins, by an aesthetic tradition that found broken columns more beautiful than whole ones, and that turned the destruction of the ancient world into a visual philosophy that made the destruction seem inevitable, natural, even desirable. Go look at the few depictions that survive from before 1687. The most detailed is a series of drawings made by a French artist named Jacques Carré in 1674, just 13 years before the explosion. Carré visited Athens and sketched the Parthenon's sculptural program in detail. His drawings show the pediments, the metops, the frieze, the sculptures that were still in place after 21 centuries, still complete, still readable, still telling the stories they were carved to tell. Carré's drawings are the last comprehensive visual record of the intact Parthenon. 13 years later, much of what he drew was rubble. The silence was deafening when I started looking for what else existed before Carré, because Carré's drawings are treated as the definitive pre-explosion record. But the Parthenon stood intact for over 2,000 years. It was visited by travelers, scholars, and artists throughout the medieval period. The Ottoman Empire maintained it as a functioning mosque. The Byzantine Empire had maintained it as a functioning church. It was a living building in continuous use for 21 centuries. Where are the depictions from those 21 centuries? They're sparse, remarkably sparse. A building that was one of the most famous structures in the ancient world, that was visited by Roman tourists who wrote about it, that was used by Christians and Muslims who worshipped inside it, that was seen by every traveler who passed through Athens for over 2 millennia, left behind almost no detailed visual record of its intact state. A few medieval sketches, a few travelers' descriptions, Carey's drawings, and that's essentially it. As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Now look at who destroyed it, because the destruction of the Parthenon wasn't an accident of war. It was a specific decision made by a specific person whose name is recorded and whose reasoning is documented. Francesco Morosini, the Venetian general commanding the siege of Athens in September 1687. The Venetians were at war with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans held the Acropolis, and the Ottoman garrison, knowing the Acropolis was about to be besieged, made a decision that has been debated for 3 centuries. They moved their ammunition into the Parthenon. The reasoning, according to the accounts that survive, was that the Venetians would not fire on the Parthenon, that the building's fame, its significance, its status as one of the wonders of the ancient world would protect it, that no Christian general would destroy the most celebrated monument of classical civilization. They were wrong. Morosini was told the ammunition was inside the Parthenon. He was told what the building was. He knew its significance. His officers knew, and he ordered his artillery to fire directly at it. The shell that detonated the ammunition magazine wasn't a stray round. It was aimed. The most famous building in the Western world was deliberately targeted by a military commander who understood what he was destroying and destroyed it anyway. The deeper I went into the military records of the siege, the more Morosini's decision looked less like a military necessity and more like something else entirely. Because the Acropolis could have been taken without destroying the Parthenon, the Venetians had superior numbers. The Ottoman garrison was small. A prolonged siege would have forced surrender. Morosini chose bombardment. He chose the fastest, most destructive option, and his artillery targeted the one building on the Acropolis that he knew contained ammunition precisely because its fame was supposed to protect it. Here's the part that the standard narrative glosses over. What Morosini did after the explosion. Because Morosini didn't just destroy the Parthenon. He tried to loot it. After the Venetians took the Acropolis, Morosini attempted to remove the sculptures from the western pediment as trophies. The rigging failed. The sculptures fell. They shattered on the ground. The pieces were left where they fell. The general who had destroyed the building then tried to steal what remained and destroyed even more in the attempt. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across the next century and a half. Because the destruction of 1687 was the beginning, not the end, of the Parthenon's dismemberment. In 1801, Lord Elgin, the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, obtained a permit of disputed legitimacy from the Ottoman authorities and began removing sculptures from the Parthenon. Over the next decade, his agents stripped approximately half of the remaining sculptural decoration from the building. Metops were sawed off the walls. Sections of the frieze were pried from the structure. Figures from the pediments were lowered by ropes and packed into crates for shipment to England. The Elgin marbles, as they're called in Britain, have been in the British Museum since 1816. Greece has been demanding their return for over 2 centuries. The standard narrative treats Elgin's removal as preservation. The sculptures were deteriorating on the ruined Acropolis. Athens was under Ottoman control. The Greeks couldn't protect their own heritage. Elgin saved the sculptures by taking them to the safety of the British Museum. This is the story Britain tells. This is the story the British Museum tells. This is the story that justifies the continued possession of another civilization's cultural heritage by the institution that holds it. But look at the sequence. The Parthenon survives intact for 21 centuries. A Venetian general deliberately destroys it in 1687. A British diplomat strips the remaining sculptures in 1801. And the story that emerges from this sequence is that the sculptures needed saving. That removal was preservation. That the people who dismembered the building were protecting what was left. The deeper I went, the more this narrative inverted itself. Because the Parthenon didn't need saving before 1687, it had survived for over 2,000 years. It survived earthquakes. It survived conquests. It survived the complete replacement of the civilization that built it by the civilization that worshipped in it, by the civilization that prayed in it. The building was not fragile. It was one of the most durable structures in human history, and its destruction was not the result of time or neglect. It was the result of a specific military decision, followed by a specific diplomatic extraction, followed by a specific cultural narrative that reframed the perpetrators as preservers. Here's where the thread connects to something I've found in every investigation I've pursued: the control of the image. Because the Parthenon, the ruin, the skeleton, the broken colonnade against the blue sky, is not just a photograph. It's a narrative that says this is what happens to ancient things. They fall apart, they crumble, they become picturesque ruins that civilized Europeans visit and admire and write poetry about. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries built an entire aesthetic philosophy around ruins. Ruins were beautiful. Ruins were profound. Ruins demonstrated the transience of human achievement and the superiority of nature over artifice. And this aesthetic philosophy, which emerged in the decades immediately following the Parthenon's destruction, performed an extraordinary cultural function. It made the destruction seem natural, inevitable, beautiful even. The ruin became the preferred state. The intact building became unimaginable. The idea that the Parthenon had stood complete within living memory of the people who were painting it as a ruin was submerged beneath an aesthetic that needed the ruin to be ancient, to be the natural consequence of time rather than the recent consequence of a mortar shell. Now look at what was inside the Parthenon before 1687. Because the building wasn't an empty shell. It housed one of the most famous works of art in the ancient world, the Athena Parthenos. A statue of the goddess Athena, over 12 meters tall, constructed of gold and ivory over a wooden frame by the sculptor Phidias. Ancient sources describe it in terms that suggest it was one of the most extraordinary objects ever created by human hands. The gold alone was estimated at over 1,000 kilograms. The ivory panels that formed the goddess's skin were worked with a precision that ancient visitors described as almost supernatural. The statue was the purpose of the building. The Parthenon was built to house Athena. The building was the container. The statue was the content. The Athena Parthenos is gone, not destroyed in 1687, gone earlier, possibly in the 5th century AD when the building was converted to a church, possibly later. Nobody knows for certain when the statue was removed or what happened to it. Over 1,000 kilograms of gold and a masterwork of ivory sculpture disappeared from history without a definitive record of its fate. The official explanation is that it was destroyed or disassembled at some point during the building's conversion from pagan temple to Christian church. But the absence of a clear record of the destruction of one of the most valuable objects in the ancient world is, in itself, extraordinary. The silence was deafening. Here's what I keep returning to: the compound nature of the loss. Because the Parthenon wasn't lost once. It was lost in stages: the statue, removed at an unknown date; the building, destroyed in 1687; the sculptures, stripped in 1801; the cultural memory, reshaped by the Romantic ruin aesthetic that made the destruction seem natural. Each stage of loss was followed by a narrative that normalized the loss and made the previous state harder to imagine. The building was converted to a church. The statue was removed. The narrative said pagan idols had no place in a Christian house of worship. The building was destroyed by bombardment. The narrative said war is tragic but inevitable. The sculptures were removed by a diplomat. The narrative said they were being saved. Each narrative made sense in its own moment, and the cumulative effect of all the narratives was the erasure of the original. The complete, functioning, sculpture-filled gold and ivory statue housing Parthenon has been so thoroughly buried under layers of loss and narrative that imagining it intact requires an act of mental reconstruction that most people have never attempted. Go look at a reconstruction image, a digital or painted rendering of the Parthenon as it appeared in the 5th century BC, with the roof, with the walls, with the sculptures painted in bright colors, reds and blues and golds that the white marble ruin doesn't suggest, with the Athena Parthenos standing in the interior, 12 meters of gold and ivory glowing in the light that filtered through the doorway. The building you'll see in the reconstruction is unrecognizable. It looks nothing like the ruin. It's vivid, it's loud, it's overwhelming. It's a building that declares power and wealth and artistic mastery at a volume that the broken colonnade cannot begin to suggest. That's what was destroyed. Not a ruin, not a skeleton, not a picturesque arrangement of broken columns against a blue sky. A complete building, intact for 21 centuries, deliberately targeted by a military commander who knew exactly what he was firing at, subsequently stripped by a diplomat who called the stripping preservation, and finally absorbed into a cultural aesthetic that made the destruction look like the natural order of things. I'm not telling you the Parthenon can be rebuilt. The original is gone. The sculptures are in London and Athens and scattered across European collections. The Athena Parthenos has been missing for over 15 centuries. What was destroyed in 1687 cannot be recovered, but I'm asking why the complete Parthenon is so absent from public imagination that most people can't picture it. I'm asking why the ruin is the only image that circulates, why the 21 centuries of intact existence are compressed into a footnote and the 3 centuries of destroyed existence define the building's identity. Why the aesthetic of the ruin has been so thoroughly normalized that imagining the building whole feels like speculation rather than history. I'm asking what else we've been taught to see as inevitable decay when the actual history is deliberate destruction. What other ancient structures were intact far more recently than we imagine? What other losses are presented as the natural entropy of time when the records show specific hands, specific orders, specific shells aimed at specific targets? I'm asking who benefits from a world that believes ancient things fall apart naturally, that sees ruins and feels the melancholy of time rather than the anger of destruction, that has been trained to find beauty in broken columns rather than asking who broke them.